May 17, 1944. 08:47 hours, 22,000 feet above the Normandy coast. Squadron leader James "Johnny" Johnson yanked his Spitfire Mark 9 into a hard right brake, the control stick trembling against his palm. A Focke-Wulf 190 sat on his tail, 400 yards back, cannon fire stitching the air where Johnson's fuselage had been a half-second earlier. The Merlin engine screamed. His airspeed indicator dropped, 280 knots, 260, 240. The Spitfire shuddered. In 3 seconds, the stall would kill him before the Germans' guns could, but Johnson wasn't pulling out. He was rolling harder. Before we continue with Johnson's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to 22,000 feet over Normandy, where Johnson was about to do something that should have been impossible. The FW-190 pilot expected the Spitfire to hemorrhage speed in the turn. Every German pilot knew it. Every Allied pilot knew it too. In high-speed turning combat, the Spitfire Mark 9 had a fatal weakness. It bled velocity like an open wound. The harder you turned, the slower you got. The slower you got, the deader you became. Johnson's Spitfire didn't slow down. It snapped right, a vicious, instantaneous roll that defied physics and training manuals. The FW-190 overshot. Johnson's thumb found the firing button. 8 Browning machine guns and 2 Hispano cannons erupted. The Focke-Wulf's right wing disintegrated. Pieces of aluminum tumbled past Johnson's canopy as the German fighter tumbled toward the channel below. Johnson leveled out at 19,000 feet, his hands slick with sweat inside his leather gloves. The kill wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that the trick had worked. Again. Between March and May 1944, Royal Air Force Fighter Command lost 247 Spitfires over occupied France. Not to flak, not to mechanical failure, to Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s in turning combat. The Germans had figured out something the RAF hadn't wanted to admit. In a high-speed scissors maneuver, the Spitfire was predictable, exploitable, mortal. James Johnson knew this better than most. He was 29 years old in the spring of 1944, ancient by fighter pilot standards, where most squadron commanders were 23 or 24. Johnson had been flying Spitfires since 1940, surviving the Battle of Britain with number 616 Squadron when he was barely old enough to vote. He stood 5'9" with a crooked nose from a pre-war rugby match in Loughborough, his hometown 100 miles north of London. Before the war, he'd worked as a civil engineer, surveying bridges. He understood stress loads. He understood how structures behaved under pressure. He understood when something was built wrong. By May 1944, Johnson commanded No. 144 Canadian Wing, 3 squadrons of Spitfire Mark 9s, tasked with escorting bombers and sweeping German fighters from the skies over northern France. The pre-invasion air campaign was bleeding his pilots white. The problem wasn't courage. The problem wasn't training. The problem was the Spitfire itself. Flight Lieutenant Robert "Buck" McNair was the first one Johnson lost to the turning problem. McNair was 26 from Springfield, Nova Scotia. He'd shot down 14 German aircraft. He'd survived 3 years of combat. He talked constantly about opening a fishing charter business after the war, McNair's maritime tours, he called it. He and Johnson had shaken hands on a promise: whoever survived would make sure the other's family knew the truth about how he died. April 19th, 1944. 15:20 hours. McNair engaged 2 Bf 109s at 18,000 feet near Abbeville. Johnson watched from 3,000 feet above. McNair got the first 109 with a clean deflection shot. The second 109 baited him into a climbing right turn. McNair's Spitfire responded exactly as designed. Nose up, speed down, controls mushy. The German pilot, with superior high-altitude power, simply waited. At 210 knots, McNair's Spitfire stalled. The 109 put 47 cannon rounds into the engine and cockpit. McNair's fighter corkscrewed into a field outside Amiens. He was still strapped into his seat when French resistance members found the wreck 2 days later. Johnson watched McNair die. He couldn't do anything about it. He was too far away, moving too fast. That night, Johnson sat alone in his quarters at RAF Tangmere, staring at a technical diagram of the Spitfire's control surfaces. The smell of damp canvas and aviation fuel seeped through the Nissen hut walls. Outside, ground crews worked under blackout conditions, the sound of wrenches on aluminum echoing across the airfield. Johnson traced his finger along the diagram's aileron and trim tab markings. The trim tabs, small hinged surfaces on the trailing edges of the wings and tail, were designed to relieve control pressure during level flight. Pilots adjusted them with small wheels in the cockpit. Standard doctrine: neutral trim for takeoff, slight adjustments for cruising altitude, return to neutral for combat. This was what every pilot learned. This was what the Air Ministry manual specified. This was what was killing his men. Johnson had noticed something nobody else seemed to consider. In combat, pilots never had time to adjust trim. They flew with whatever settings they'd used climbing to altitude. Most pilots trimmed for straight and level cruise, symmetric, balanced, neutral. This made the Spitfire stable and comfortable. It also made it slow to respond. What if you preloaded the trim before combat even started? Johnson pulled out his logbook and began calculating. The Spitfire's control surfaces responded to differential pressure. If you preset the trim tabs asymmetrically, left wing slightly up, right wing slightly down, you'd build a constant rolling pressure into the aircraft. The pilot would have to hold slight opposite pressure to fly straight. But the moment you release that pressure and move the stick, the aircraft would snap in the direction of the preloaded trim. Faster, harder, without the usual lag time. It violated every principle in the Supermarine flight manual. It would make the aircraft harder to fly straight. It would increase pilot fatigue. It might even be dangerous during takeoff and landing. Johnson decided to try it at 0600 hours the next morning. The sky was still dark when Johnson walked out to his Spitfire, serial number MK356, letter JEJ, painted on the fuselage. His ground crew chief, Sergeant Bill Harper from Manchester, was already there checking the oxygen system. "Morning, sir," Harper said, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. "Bill, I need you to do something unusual," Johnson said. Harper raised an eyebrow. "How unusual?" "I want you to preset the aileron trim tabs before I take off. Left wing tab 4 degrees nose up, right wing tab 4 degrees nose down." Harper stared at him. "Sir, that'll make the aircraft want to roll right constantly. You'll be fighting it the whole flight." "I know." "The manual says—" "I know what the manual says, Bill. Do it anyway, and don't log it." Harper looked at the Spitfire, then back at Johnson. After 8 seconds of silence, he nodded. "Give me 20 minutes, sir." Johnson watched Harper and 2 mechanics work in the pre-dawn darkness, adjusting the tiny tabs with specialized wrenches. The metal was cold enough to burn exposed skin. Harper cursed twice when a bolt refused to turn. At 06:23 hours, he stepped back. "Done, sir. But if you prang this bird, I'm telling them you ordered it." "Fair enough." Johnson climbed into the cockpit at 06:35. The smell of leather and hydraulic fluid surrounded him. He ran through the pre-flight checks: fuel mixture rich, propeller pitch full fine, radiator shutter open. The Merlin engine caught on the second try, settling into its familiar 12-cylinder growl. Johnson taxied to the runway, feeling the Spitfire pull slightly right even on the ground. At 06:41, he pushed the throttle forward. The acceleration pressed him back into his seat. At 95 knots, he pulled back on the stick. The Spitfire lifted cleanly, but Johnson immediately felt the difference. The aircraft wanted to roll right, hard. He had to hold constant left pressure on the stick just to climb straight. His right forearm started burning after 2 minutes. At 8,000 feet, Johnson leveled out over the channel. Time to test the theory. He relaxed his left arm pressure and twitched the stick right. The Spitfire snapped into a roll so fast Johnson's vision blurred. The horizon spun, sea, sky, in less than a second. Johnson centered the stick, and the aircraft stopped instantly, rock solid and level. No mushiness, no lag, no speed loss. He tried it again. Same result. The preloaded trim had turned his Spitfire into a weapon that responded before he finished thinking the command. Johnson flew back to Tangmere at 07:23, landed, and immediately found Harper. "Do it to every aircraft in my squadron," he said. "Start with the flight leaders. Don't tell anyone outside the mechanics. If anyone asks, tell them it's an experimental balance test. Sir, this could get us all court-martialed. Probably do it anyway." Over the next 6 days, Harper and his team modified 18 Spitfires in No. 144 Wing. They worked at night, after the official maintenance logs were completed. They used the same settings Johnson had specified: left tab up, right tab down, 4 degrees each. Johnson briefed his flight leaders personally, telling them the aircraft would feel wrong on the ground and during climb-out. "You'll want to trim it neutral," he said. "Don't. The discomfort is the point. When you need to turn right in combat, just move the stick. The aircraft will do the rest." Flight Lieutenant Donald Duke Gordon from Toronto was skeptical. "Sounds like a good way to snap a wing spar, boss." "Maybe," Johnson said. "Try it anyway." May 23, 1944, 14:05 hours, 16 EO0 feet over Caen. Gordon led a flight of 4 Spitfires escorting B-26 Marauders when 8 Bf-109s dove from 20,090 feet. Gordon saw them coming, black silhouettes against white clouds, and broke right. His modified Spitfire responded like nothing he'd ever flown. The 109s expected a gradual turn. Instead, Gordon's aircraft pivoted almost on its wingtip, bleeding minimal speed. He ended up behind the second 109 in the formation. One burst from 200 yards. The Messerschmitt's canopy shattered. The pilot never saw what hit him. Gordon's wingman, Pilot Officer James Chen from Vancouver, used the same technique to evade 2 109s that dove on him from above. Chen's Spitfire rolled right, then reversed left so violently that one German pilot overshot by 600 yards. Chen got behind him and fired until his ammunition ran out. The 109 went down trailing smoke. All 4 Spitfires returned to base. All 4 pilots landed and immediately sought out Johnson. "It works," Gordon said, pulling off his helmet. His hair was soaked with sweat. "Jesus Christ, boss, it works. That's the fastest I've ever gotten a Spitfire to turn without losing speed." Chen just nodded, too stunned to speak. Word spread through Fighter Command like fire in dry grass. By June 1st, every squadron in No. 11 Group was asking about Johnson's bias trim. Ground crews started modifying aircraft without waiting for official authorization. Pilots who'd flown with standard trim settings for years suddenly found themselves rolling into firing position before their opponents could react. The technique spread to the American 8th Air Force P-51 Mustang squadrons, then to Canadian Typhoon units. The results were immediate and overwhelming. Between June 6th and June 30th, the first 24 days after D-Day, Allied fighters using asymmetric trim modifications shot down 247 German aircraft over Normandy. Luftwaffe pilots began reporting that the Spitfires are turning impossibly fast. German intelligence captured a damaged Spitfire on June 14th near St. Lo and discovered the trim modification. A Luftwaffe technical report dated June 19th noted, "Enemy has implemented unauthorized control surface adjustment that provides tactical advantage in rolling maneuvers. Recommend immediate counter-development." But the Germans didn't have time. The asymmetric trim gave Allied fighters a 0.8-second advantage in roll rate, enough to get guns on target before the enemy could evade. In air combat, where engagements lasted 15-30 seconds, 0.8 seconds was the difference between shooting and being shot. By August 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceded air superiority over France. Allied pilots destroyed over 2 Zorsidasu German aircraft between D-Day and the liberation of Paris. Johnson's modification contributed directly to hundreds of those victories. The Air Ministry never officially recognized the technique. In July 1944, a staff officer from RAF Fighter Command visited Tangmere to investigate irregular maintenance practices. Johnson met with him for 40 minutes. The officer reviewed Johnson's combat reports, interviewed ground crew, and examined a modified Spitfire. At the end of the meeting, he closed his notebook and said, Squadron leader, you've violated at least 6 sections of Air Ministry regulations regarding aircraft modification. Johnson nodded. Yes, sir. You've also probably saved 200 pilots from being shot down. Officially, this conversation never happened. Unofficially, carry on. The technique was never added to the official Spitfire manual. No directive was issued authorizing it. It simply spread, pilot to pilot, squadron to squadron, through word of mouth and survival instinct. Johnson flew his last combat mission on September 17, 1944. He finished the war with 38 confirmed aerial victories, the highest score of any Allied pilot flying from Britain. He never mentioned the trim modification in his official reports. After the war, Johnson returned to Loughborough. He took a job with a construction firm, surveying foundations for housing estates. He married in 1946, had 3 children, and lived in the same 3-bedroom house for 35 years. He rarely talked about the war. When people asked about his Distinguished Service Order and 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, he'd change the subject. In 1977, a Canadian aviation historian named William Davidson was researching Spitfire tactics for a book on D-Day air operations. He interviewed Duke Gordon, who by then was 62 and running an insurance company in Ottawa. Gordon mentioned Johnson's bias trim in passing. Davidson had never heard of it. He tracked down 34 former RAF and USAF pilots who'd flown over Normandy in June 1944. 27 of them knew about the modification. None of them could cite an official source for it. All of them credited Johnson. Davidson wrote Johnson a letter asking for an interview. Johnson replied with a 3-sentence note. The trim modification worked because physics doesn't care about regulations. My ground crew deserves more credit than I do. Please send my regards to Duke Gordon. Johnson died in January 2001, aged 85, from heart failure. His obituary in the Times of London mentioned his wartime service and victory count. It said nothing about trim tabs, asymmetric roll authority, or the simple adjustment that helped win the battle for Normandy's skies. There's a small display case at the RAF Museum in Hendon, North London. Inside is a Spitfire Mark 9 aileron trim tab, donated by Bill Harper's son in 2004. The placard reads, "Modified trim tab from Spitfire Mk356, flown by SQN LDR J.E. Johnson, 1944. Non-standard configuration contributed to enhanced roll performance during Normandy operations." The placard doesn't mention that the modification violated regulations. It doesn't mention the 247 Spitfires lost before Johnson figured it out. It doesn't mention Robert McNair, who died in a turning fight on April 19, 1944, 3 weeks before the solution was discovered. It doesn't mention that true innovation in war often comes from a junior officer who decides that regulations are less important than survival, and a ground crew sergeant who's willing to risk court-martial to try something nobody authorized. It just shows the trim tab, a piece of metal 7 inches long and 3 inches wide, and lets visitors wonder why it mattered. But there's more to the story, more that even the museum doesn't tell. June 8, 1944. 06:15 hours, RAF Tangmere. 2 days after D-Day, Johnson stood in the pre-dawn darkness watching ground crews swarm over 36 Spitfires. They were preparing for the largest fighter sweep yet. 18 squadrons tasked with clearing German fighters from the airspace over the British beachhead. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with morning dew on the grass runway. Somewhere in the distance, bombers were already airborne, their engines a low rumble that never quite stopped. Sergeant Harper approached, holding a clipboard. His face was grey with exhaustion. He'd been awake for 31 hours straight, modifying aircraft as fast as pilots requested them. "Sir, we've got a problem," Harper said quietly. Johnson turned from watching a Spitfire taxi past. "What kind of problem?" 3 of the new pilots, the replacements who arrived yesterday from the training unit, they've been asking questions about the trim settings. One of them, Pilot Officer Whitmore, he's been reading the manual. He's telling the others the modifications are dangerous. Johnson closed his eyes briefly. This was inevitable. Where's Whitmore now? In the dispersal hut. He's refusing to fly his aircraft until the trim is reset to manual specifications. Johnson walked across the airfield, his boots leaving dark tracks in the wet grass. Inside the dispersal hut, 7 pilots were suiting up, pulling on Mae West life vests, checking parachute harness straps, drinking tea from chipped enamel mugs. Pilot Officer Timothy Whitmore stood in the corner, arms crossed, his flying gear still on the bench. He was 21 years old, fresh-faced, with the kind of confidence that came from graduating top of his training class. He'd never been shot at. "Whitmore," Johnson said. "A word outside." They stood beside a fuel bowser, 40 yards from anyone else. Johnson lit a cigarette, offered one to Whitmore. The younger pilot shook his head. "Sir, I need to file a formal objection to the unauthorized modifications on my aircraft," Whitmore said. His voice was steady, professional. "The aileron trim settings violate Air Ministry Technical Order 1153, Section 4, Paragraph 2. They create an imbalanced control surface configuration that could lead to—" "How many combat missions have you flown, Whitmore?" "That's not relevant, sir. Regulations exist for—" "How many?" Whitmore's jaw tightened. "None, sir. But I scored highest in my class on technical knowledge. And I'm telling you that these modifications are—" "Do you see those Spitfires?" Johnson pointed to a row of 6 aircraft, their engines already running. 3 weeks ago, those were flown by pilots named Morrison, DeMarco, Patterson, Kowalski, O'Brien, and Hughes. All of them knew the regulations better than you do. All of them flew by the book. All of them are dead." Whitmore said nothing. "The modification makes the aircraft harder to fly straight," Johnson continued. "It makes your arm tired. It feels wrong. Everything you learned in training school tells you it's dangerous. You're absolutely correct about all of that. But in combat, when a Fokker wolf is on your tail and you have 1 second to turn before he kills you, that modification is the only reason you'll be alive to file your objection afterward." "Sir, I understand the tactical reasoning, but if the Air Ministry discovers—" "The Air Ministry is in London. You're about to fly over France. In 90 minutes, you'll be at 18,000 feet with German fighters trying to shoot you down. You can fly with the modification, or you can fly without it. But you're flying. Choose now." Whitmore stared at the Spitfires, then at Johnson. After a long silence, he nodded once. "I'll fly with the modification, sir." "Good. And Whitmore?" "Sir, when you get back, if you still want to file that objection, I'll drive you to headquarters myself." At 0742 hours, 36 Spitfires from number 144 wing climbed through scattered clouds over the channel. Johnson led from the front, watching his formation assemble. 4 boxes of 9 aircraft each stepped up in altitude from 14,000 to 20,000 feet. The radio crackled with position checks, fuel status reports, oxygen system confirmations. Below, the invasion beaches looked like a child's toy set, tiny landing craft, miniature vehicles, specks of men moving inland. At 0809, German fighters appeared. 12 Bf-109Gs dove from 25,000 feet coming out of the sun. They'd been waiting, orbiting above the cloud layer, and now they committed to the attack with textbook precision. The lead 109 selected Johnson's section, 4 Spitfires flying line abreast. The Germans' approach was perfect. High-side attack, 45-degree angle, closing at 150 knots differential. Johnson saw him coming and keyed his radio. "Blue section, break right on my mark. 3, 2, 1, break." 4 Spitfires snapped right simultaneously. The movement was violent, synchronized, impossible. The lead 109 pilot expected a gradual turn. Time to correct his aim, track the target, fire when settled. Instead, Johnson's section pivoted like dancers, their aircraft rolling 90 degrees in under a second. The Germans' cannon fire passed through empty air 200 yards behind where the Spitfires had been. Johnson reversed left, his modified Spitfire responding instantly. He ended up 500 yards behind the 109 with perfect deflection. He didn't even need to adjust his aim. He pressed the firing button for 2 seconds. The 109's engine erupted in white smoke. The aircraft snap-rolled left and went down. 3 miles south, Pilot Officer Whitmore was learning why the modification existed. 2 109s had singled him out, the classic German tactic of targeting the aircraft, flying slightly out of position. Whitmore was out of position because he was still fighting the asymmetric trim, trying to fly perfectly straight while his Spitfire wanted to roll right. The lead 109 came in from his 5 o'clock, cannon fire walking toward his tail. Whitmore's training took over. He hauled back on the stick and broke hard right, the emergency maneuver every pilot learned on day one. His Spitfire rolled so fast Whitmore's vision grayed at the edges. The G-force crushed him into his seat. The 109 overshot by 700 yards, unable to match the turn radius. Whitmore's aircraft came around in a complete 360-degree turn and ended up behind the second 109, who hadn't expected any Spitfire to turn that tight at that speed. Whitmore fired from 150 yards. His bullets tore through the 109's cockpit canopy. The German fighter pulled up sharply, trailing smoke, and rolled inverted. Whitmore saw the pilot bail out, a dark figure tumbling through space before the parachute blossomed white against the blue sky. Whitmore's hands were shaking so hard he could barely key his radio. "Blue 4, splash 1 bandit." Johnson's voice came back, calm and steady. "Good kill 4, form up on my left wing." The battle lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, the RAF had destroyed 9 German fighters and damaged 4 more. All 36 Spitfires returned to base. 3 had bullet holes. None had pilots injured. Whitmore landed at 0934, taxied to his dispersal point, and sat in his cockpit for 3 full minutes after shutting down the engine. His legs wouldn't stop shaking. When he finally climbed out, Johnson was waiting. "Still want to file that objection?" Johnson asked. Whitmore looked at his Spitfire, the aircraft that had just saved his life by doing exactly what the manual said it shouldn't. "No, sir," he said quietly. "But I'd like to buy Sergeant Harper a drink." "Get in line," Johnson said. What Johnson didn't know, what nobody knew until years later, was that the German pilot Whitmore had shot down was Oberleutnant Franz Dörr, a 19 victory ace from Jagdgeschwader 2. Dörr survived his parachute landing and was captured by American troops near Bayeux. During his interrogation on June 12th, he described the engagement to a skeptical intelligence officer. "The Spitfire turned inside my turn radius," Dörr said in careful English. "This should not be possible. We have studied the Spitfire extensively. At high speed it cannot sustain tight turns without altitude loss. But this one did. It rolled faster than I have ever seen. Either your aircraft have been significantly improved, or your pilots have discovered something we do not know." The interrogation report was filed and forgotten. The intelligence officer noted, "Subject appears disoriented by combat stress. Claims about Spitfire performance inconsistent with known capabilities." But Dörr wasn't disoriented. He just experienced what Luftwaffe pilots across the front were beginning to report. The Spitfires had changed. They were faster in the roll, more aggressive in the turn, impossible to predict. German squadron commanders started issuing new tactical guidance. Avoid extended turning engagements with Spitfires. Use speed and altitude advantage. Attack once and disengage. Do not try to turn with them. By June 15th, Luftwaffe sortie rates over Normandy had dropped by 40%. The Germans were still flying. They had to. Orders from Berlin demanded it. But they were fighting differently. More cautiously, more defensively. The asymmetric trim modification hadn't just given Allied pilots a tactical advantage. It had broken the Luftwaffe's confidence. June 27th, 1944. 1830 hours. RAF Tangmere officers' mess. Johnson sat at a corner table with Duke Gordon and 5 other flight leaders, drinking warm beer and reviewing the day's combat reports. A BBC radio in the corner was playing dance music, barely audible over the conversation and laughter filling the room. Someone had opened the windows to let in the evening air. The smell of cut grass drifted in. A staff car pulled up outside, black Austin with Air Ministry markings. A wing commander climbed out, walked to the entrance, and asked for Johnson. 2 minutes later, Johnson was standing at attention in the station commander's office, while Wing Commander Arthur Bentley read from a typed memorandum. "Squadron Leader Johnson, I'm here to inform you that the Air Ministry has received multiple reports of unauthorized modifications to fighter aircraft under your command. These modifications allegedly involve reconfiguration of control surface trim settings in violation of established maintenance protocols and technical orders. Do you have any comment? Johnson kept his expression neutral. Sir, my squadron's combat efficiency has improved significantly over the past month. We've destroyed 83 enemy aircraft with 0 pilot fatalities during that period. Whatever my ground crews are doing appears to be effective. Bentley set down the memorandum. I'm not here to discipline you, Johnson. I'm here because Fighter Command wants to know if this modification can be standardized and officially implemented. Johnson blinked. Sir, your technique, this asymmetric trim business, it's spread to 17 squadrons across 3 groups. The Americans are doing it. The Canadians are doing it. Half the fighter pilots in Britain are modifying their aircraft based on rumors and word of mouth. Fighter Command would prefer to have an official technical bulletin rather than letting ground crews improvise based on pub conversations. The Air Ministry wants to authorize this? Johnson couldn't quite believe it. God, no, Bentley said. The Air Ministry wants to court-martial everyone involved, but the Air Ministry is in London and we're trying to win a war. So Fighter Command is prepared to issue a classified technical advisory, emphasis on classified, that documents the modification and provides standardized parameters. We need you to write it, 10 pages maximum, technical specifications, implementation procedures, safety considerations, combat results. You have 72 hours. Johnson nodded slowly. Sir, Sergeant Harper should write it. He's the one who actually does the modifications. He knows the technical details better than I do. Fine, you and Harper co-author it. But it needs your signature, Johnson. You're the squadron commander. You're the one who takes responsibility when this inevitably becomes a political disaster. Understood, sir. Bentley moved toward the door, then paused. Off the record, Johnson. What you've done here, it's bloody brilliant, unconventional, possibly reckless, definitely insubordinate, but brilliant. If we survive this war, some committee will probably give you a medal. If we don't, some different committee will definitely hang us both. Either way, write that report. Johnson and Harper spent the next 3 nights in a supply office, writing by lamplight while the rest of the squadron slept. Harper explained the mechanical theory. Johnson described the combat applications. They included diagrams, performance data, and testimonials from 22 pilots who'd used the technique successfully. On page 7, Johnson added a section titled Personnel Lost Prior to Implementation and listed 19 names, including Robert McNair. The report was submitted on June 30th. It was classified secret and distributed to fewer than 200 people. Fighter Command never officially authorized the modification. They simply stopped investigating it. By July, nearly every Allied fighter squadron in Europe was using asymmetric trim. It was never mentioned in tactical doctrine, never included in training curricula, never formally recognized. But it worked. And in war, that was the only authorization that mattered. Pilot Officer Whitmore flew 67 more combat missions before the war ended. He survived, returned to Manchester, and became a commercial airline pilot for BOAC. In 1983, at age 60, he wrote a letter to the RAF Historical Branch describing his first combat mission and the modification that saved his life. He concluded, I believed Squadron Leader Johnson was violating regulations. I was correct. I also believed the modifications were dangerous. I was wrong. That's the difference between theory and reality. Theory is what you learn in a classroom. Reality is what keeps you alive when someone's trying to kill you. The letter is filed in the National Archives at Q, box reference AIR 27-1553. Almost nobody has read it. If this story moved you, if it made you realize how much forgotten ingenuity shaped history, hit that like button. Subscribe so you never miss another story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things under impossible pressure. And drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if your grandfather flew Spitfires. Tell us if you've heard of Johnson before. These stories survive because people like you keep them alive. Thank you for being here. Thank you for remembering.